Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Four Mothers of the Women's Spirituality Online Resource Center. I'm your hostess, Vajra Ma, and the curator of the Resource Center. And today we are here with Four Mother Judy Grahn. Good morning, Judy.
Good morning.
It's wonderful to have you here. I am going to give a short introduction first to put our interview in context for the people out there, and then I'm going to read your bio, and then we'll get started, okay?
Oh, wonderful, Vajra. I'm thrilled that you're doing this. I'm so happy for it and excited.
I am too. It's something that really needs to happen, and what's coming through in these interviews is so rich. So I want everyone to know who's listening that the women's spirituality movement emerged as a major component of what's today called the second wave of feminism, or second wave of women's liberation. And this emergence took place in the 1970s and 1980s during the second wave. But a lot of people, many people today, do not know about these four mothers of women's spirituality. These women who are courageous and radical. And by that I mean to the root. These women developed authentic spiritual experiences and practices beyond the boundaries of patriarchal religions. They followed their conviction, their inner knowing, their passion, and they built upon and created, many of them, a growing scholarly historical knowledge. And many of the women also brought through intact the indigenous traditions and wisdoms to connect us with the nature and female-honoring spirituality that preceded the last 6,000 to 10,000 years of patriarchal father gods. The Four Mothers, along with many other feminists, pioneered a diverse spiritual orientation that is based in respect, reverence, and relationship with all. These four mothers are not only historically significant, but they are significant because many of them are continuing their vital work today, 50 years later. And that is why this resource center was created, to provide an historical overview via personal testimonies and recollections about the first 2 decades, the formative decades of the women's spirituality movement, and to learn about their ongoing work today. So we're inviting you to meet these women through the form of taped interviews with additional interviews and resources to be expanded as time goes on. And our interview today with Judy Grahn is taking place in May 2018. And I want to read a short bio of Judy Grahn's work because she's been active in her work since the mid-60s. Judy Grahn is internationally known as a poet, a writer, and a cultural theorist. Her writings helped fuel, globally, second-wave feminist, gay, and lesbian activism, as well as women's and queer spirituality. She received the Fred Cody Lifetime Achievement Award for Literature and Community Service, 2 American Book Awards, 2 Lambda Literature Awards, a Four Mothers of Women's Spirituality Award, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from Triangle Publishers, who also established the Judy Grahn Nonfiction Award in 1996. In 2014, she was Lifetime Achievement Grand Marshal of the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade. Grahn has published 14 books with several more in process. Publications include 2 book-length poems, several poetry collections, the Judy Grahn Reader from Aunt Loot Press, an Ecotopian novel, and 5 nonfiction books. And among those are Another Mother Tongue, Gay Words, Gay Worlds, Blood, Bread, and Roses, How Menstruation Created the World, and her memoir, A Simple Revolution, The Making of an Activist Poet. A collection of 9-part poems, Hanging on Our Own Bone, is her latest from Red Hen Press. Judy, welcome.
Thank you, Vajra.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
oh, well, it's just we could talk for hours and hours and hours about what you've done and your theorism and your knowledge and your writings. What I'd like to start with, so people get a sense of what it was like back when you began in the 60s. If you could give us a picture from your own personal experience and perspective of how your work began, how you discovered what we're calling women's spirituality, and how did a spiritual movement emerge out of a political movement?
Okay, that's a big question. So I'll just dive right in and see if I am addressing what you're talking about. I think the first thing to probably know about me is that I come from a working class family, and I came out to myself as a lesbian in 1956, just really by looking the word lesbian up in the dictionary. And I joined the military service because I was literally starving to death in New Mexico trying to earn a living on my own, and was kicked out for being a lesbian, which was very traumatic to me. It included interrogation and shaming of my parents, and my father did not speak to me for a decade. So let's start there, because that radicalized me in particular ways. And in my early 20s, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I joined Mattachine Society, which was really a quite middle-class organization of mostly men wanting to address some of the institutions that are arraigned and have been traditionally arraigned against homosexuality, and they had, their politic was just about government clearances and that sort of thing, and changing the law some, but also the leader, Frank Kameny, was very interested in challenging the psychological institutions that were pathologizing us. And I was influenced by this. I picketed with them. I picketed the White House and had to drop out of the march to the Pentagon because my girls' shoes, which I just never wore, these little pumps, I guess they're called, that were cardboard, and they made my feet bleed, so I had to drop out of that. But I learned from that I could use my writing, and I had always been a poet since I was 9. I wanted to use my writing for something that mattered, and I realized it could matter, that I could write something that would challenge the psychological pathologizing of lesbians and gay people. So I did that, and my very first published article was in a magazine called Sexology magazine that you could only buy at sort of grade B newsstands. Came in a brown wrapper so that it would be anonymous, and that was my first publication. And at the same time, I also wrote a satire. After getting out of the service, I had gone to a psychiatrist whose idea of that he should cure me was that what was wrong with me was that men didn't find me attractive. And so if I would just, enhance my breast size and wear eyelashes, that would solve everything. You can see how absolutely mechanistic and male-centered this theory, and he was a radical, believe me. He was really a radical because he was not wanting us in jail, wanting us in mental hospitals, as some of my peers that I met later, that is what happened to them. So I was quite radicalized by this, and my satire, which was called Edward the Dyke the psychoanalysis of Edward the Dyke was written, the first draft of it in 1965, and a little bit later when I formed my own movement, that gay women's liberation, and that morphed into lesbian feminism, I used that piece, and I even called my first poetry book Edward the Dyke and Other Poems. Of course, it isn't a poem, it's a little satire. And it's still in print. It's still in print, it's still being anthologized. What that tells you is that these issues that I bumped up against are still with us. We're still struggling with that, even though Kameny and Barbara Giddings, who was a lesbian activist of the 60s, they confronted the psychological associations and overturned the pathologizing of homosexuality. But transgender is still diagnosed as we speak today, and that's a different issue. I want to now say that the spirituality emerged inside of me. It isn't that I discovered a movement, but that one of the first poems that I wrote that was meaningful to me in the 60s was almost like a prayer poem that I wrote to a woman I knew who had wanted to be an artist, but instead was going off on weekends and being getting money as a hooker to support her artist boyfriend. And I wrote the poem as a kind of prayer to her, to the earth, what earth, earth take care of her, earth cover her, earth, let purple ravens fly out in formation, to honor her existence. It was like a prayer poem. I see that now. At the time, I wasn't thinking like that at all. But there's something, when you're a poet and you use a lot of metaphors and mythology, you're going to be a spiritual activist, whether you acknowledge that or not. It's just factually true. So that was already surfacing in me. It's how it came to be that one of the anthologies that a man put together of international poets, Jerome Rothenberg, in this about 1970. The anthology is called Technicians of the Sacred. And when I saw that, it just so resonated with me that, yes, that made total sense. So when I wrote as woman-centered poems, the common woman poems, I didn't think of them as spiritual poems, but the spirituality is inherent in them. So I have one that is about wine and blood and being crazy at the edge of things, and dancing off the edge of the dock, and shaving her head. There's one of the last one. It mentions even a third eye, that here is a woman who had a mole in the middle of her forehead, right where her third eye was. So I was already influenced, living in California, and influenced by the religions of India, because so many teachers came over in the 60s and 70s and were very welcomed in the Southwest, especially, and in California. So here was this spiritual vapor, just seeping into me and coming out as the poetry. Just sort of.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. But I am interrupting. I want to comment on that, how profound that is, because real spirituality is connected to our connection to others, to our love for others. And it is natural. Real spirituality is natural, and it includes feelings and compassion and connection, as opposed to a mental doctrine of rules and regulations.
Absolutely, that is exactly right. That's exactly what was happening. It was just organically surfacing out of this long tradition of poets, and poets have been the carriers, like artists. Artists have as well, visual artists and dancers, but poets especially, I think, have been purveyors of just what you're talking about, the connectedness that. And spirituality literally means that. It literally means, it means spirit, but it also, religion means, to tie everything together. So there's connection always has to do with that. And I was in the context of a movement that was trying very hard to work with the left and be a resistance. This is in the middle of the Vietnam War, one of the most brutal events in human history. And there was a great movement of resistance against it, this male blood ritual, as I came to understand it later. And here rose women's voices wanting to assert themselves. And so the lesbian feminists, we had, lots of us had some experience and working out in the world, as the middle-class white women had not. They had been expected to stay home and just raise the kids, but they wanted into the workforce and needed to get into the workforce. So we were people who put these institutions together, learned how to work a press all by ourselves, learned how to haul things around and wash our hands and, do all kinds of very muscular things. We called ourselves dyke warriors. That's how we thought of ourselves. And we tried to work within the context of leftist movement. But the Marx, even the left, even Marxism was homophobic and was not accepting of us at all. And we had to challenge that. And we had to challenge the medical people. And we had to challenge, as you rightly brought out, religion. So I was one of the people, and I was one of the very first women, lesbians, who said that dyke lesbian energy should go toward feminism, that this was the great movement that we should be attached to. And we shouldn't forget anti-racism and anti-classism and being against the war, but that women were where it was at. That was the movement that was going to be appropriate for us to put all of our effort toward. And so whole gangs of us did that and opened bookstores and that sort of thing. I think of us as operating portals through which, masses and masses of women could pass. Bookstores, re-education, job training, battered women's shelters, medical clinics that included abortion clinics and so on. We just were doing the gamut of it. And I laid down some of this in my memoir, A Simple Revolution, so it's possible to read more about that. But in the meantime, this spiritual piece kept knocking on my door. And so this third group of poems that I wrote, which was called She Who, I just imagined a centrality of womanness and tried to draw from anything I knew that could speak to that. And what emerged is actually a spiritual book. But because I didn't say that overtly and I never used the word goddess, I just said she who, it was acceptable in that context. And it's what Alicia Ostreicher, a poet and a critic, excellent at both of those, would later call the goddess as a verb. So is, she who, she who, she who, she who, stuff like that, very, a lot of chants and that kind of thing, but also some natural images is in there. It's very some of it really lyrical, and it's been put to music 3 or 4 times. And that's why, because it's based so much in rhythms. So that all happened, and a 9-part poem that's quite political called "The Woman Is Talking to Death" that's happened as well. And now we're talking about 1972 for "She Who" and 1973 for "A Woman Is Talking to Death." And then after that 9-part poem, I felt I had said everything I could possibly say in poetry, and I needed now to do some research. I needed to know more. By this time, Max Dashu was presenting goddess imagery, and at this bookstore that I mentioned, she would come and produce her stuff. She did the cover of one of my albums. We published some of her work, and so there was an overlap. We were stepping a little bit away from the leftist materialists. They're just so riveted in that particular direction, or they were at that time as a movement, and we were breaking free from that, and so were other feminists, may I say. Jane Alpert had written about the matriarchy, and it was quite stunning because she had been a very radical New Yorker, and here she was writing about the matriarchy. So this all was on the table, The bookstore brought me Maria Gimbutas's very first book in English for me to study, in my little room, and I avidly took after that. And in 1973, I'd realized I wanted to research menstruation. I thought that this would lead me to women's contributions to science. It actually led me to a much bigger place than that, but that's where I started at that time. And then I overlapped with Audre Lorde, among other poets, and toward the end of the 70s, she wrote something called The Black Unicorn, where she, in the middle of being an extremely political poet, she was surfacing with some African terms and images and, goddess companions and so on. And I felt a lot of permission from that to just fearlessly engage with what I wanted to do, which I wanted to explore women's mythology, and I wanted to know what about goddesses, what about matriarchy, what about women's powers that really did engage with the sacred. So from that, going into the 80s, it was a no-brainer for me to take up Helen of Troy, and I did. Let me take a breath. I know I'm running at 90 miles an hour here, but
it's fascinating. I'm fascinated with this through line and how you are illuminating how politics and through the eyes of a poet and through the deep feeling of women and lesbians and woman energy, how it just naturally started moving towards the sacred, because it's integral. It's integral to that view of life.
Yes, I think that's right. It did that for some of us. It certainly didn't do it for everyone. So there was a split between what the people who said they were political feminists and who said that those of us who were doing these other explorations were cultural feminists. And there was a thought that we were diverting people off into some channels that were not going to actually be revolutionary, something that I think we disagreed with. And one of the people who disagreed the most was Charlene Spetnak. And she put an anthology together called The Politics of Women's Spirituality, and actually came to me and commissioned me to write something about menstruation, because I'd been speaking about it, in my readings. I did so many readings. I was doing 80 readings a year by that time. and that kept up, for decades. Um, so that was my first real entree into what was 13 years later, 10 years later, going to be called Blood, Bread, and Roses, How Menstruation Created the World. But along the way, I wrote a book-length poem about Helen of Troy, and very soon somebody came along who introduced me to the poetry of Inanna, which had just been published. I think in '82 it came out, probably the same year as Charlene's anthology. And that poetry has just, as I described it recently, it's had me by the nose ring, to use a Sumerian term. So I've been riveted by this goddess, who of course is the planet Venus, and her overlap with characters like Helen of Troy or Helena, the Sophia of the Gnostics. There's just, it's irresistible as a poet not to just dive into this and swim around in it. It's just so rich.
Yeah. So
both of my book-length poems have been about that. The second one is Queen of Swords, and it's actually the descent myth set in a lesbian bar. And I realize now it's very campy from my early exposure to gay men in bars and their campy humor. This is just crammed full of campy humor. And that's fine. It makes it entertaining. But it is also a piece of Inanna literature. So, that has happened. So anyway, lots of writing that has grown out of this exploration of a combination of women's power and ancient or contemporary goddess traditions. Has just informed my work through the whole 80s and into the 90s, and then it exploded in the 90s because I actually, by that time, was invited into the first academic program of women's spirituality, which was put together by Eleanor Gaydon, who just passed this last week, and was my teacher in that program. She was directing that program, and I'd always known I was going to get a PhD, but I couldn't imagine how I would do that in the academy, because I have to say, not only that I'm a lesbian, but I also don't quite read as gender ordinary, and my voice is too low, and my gestures and I'm very intense.
Yeah.
Anyway, I could not imagine how I would ever get a PhD, and yet I knew I had this not knowing, this female way of knowing, let's say, or intuitive way of knowing that I was going to get one. And sure enough, here came her program. It was perfect for me. I already knew most of what she was teaching, and yet I had a sense I was going to get something out of it besides just a PhD, and I certainly did. And one of those things was...
You started teaching, right?
Well, I had been teaching. I started teaching in '75. I started teaching women how to write. And I did that and was taught to do that by a couple of independent women's schools that existed in the early 80s. So you can't imagine what a range of institutions women just simply put together. And it was a lot. It was lesbians who did it. And so these were, one of them was not lesbian, but the other one was, and they taught me how to teach. And I'm grateful, so grateful for them. They were women's writing workshops, on the East Coast, one at Ithaca and one at Cazenovia in New York. So I would go to them every year and learn to teach. So I'd been teaching, but not in the academy, especially. What happened in Eleanor's program is that I hooked up with a colleague, Diane Jeanette, who is very, very gripped by India. And by then I had published Blood Red Roses and done all kinds of research and had come up with this new origin story about women's rituals as what actually makes us different from other creatures, from other primates. So that had already happened, and then immediately a year later I was in this program and able to take this idea to South India and actually make a study examining the menstrual rituals and menarche rituals, which are celebrations there still, even today, and compare that to their goddess rituals, and the goddess temples were all over the place. And we went there to do that co-researching. She had her own subject that she was working on. I'm talking about Diane. In 1996 and 1997, we just went and immersed ourselves in community and were these helpless Western women and learned how to cope and were invited to all kinds of really amazing rituals and learned from South India. I can't tell you how grateful we both are that this happened. To us, it was fortuitous, and it was on the cusp of the culture changing dramatically toward a global economy, which means an economy that is much more patriarchally oriented in every way. So we got to witness an old agricultural land and its interconnection. The goddess can manifest as any creature, as trees, as the land itself. The land itself would menstruate every year, 120 years ago. The land itself was Bhumi Devi, a goddess who would menstruate, and there would be 3 days where no one could work, and many other rituals around this. That's this astonishing thing that for Western women who had a broken tradition of menstruation being suppressed from, as I now know, from the time that they converted to any of the patriarchal religions, that tradition of honoring menstruation, having it be public, having it have enormous amounts of power, beyond our imagination, beyond even anything I can describe, and I try mightily to describe it. It's astounding. You can see how I remain still transfixed by that whole thing.
Judy, is there a place that people can read about? Is there a place that people can read about your experiences there with Diane Jeanette in India?
Yes, you can read my dissertation, which is available from California Institute of Integral Studies. So it's possible to get a copy of that. That's right. And hers as well. She did her dissertation studying a massive porridge cooking ritual called Pangala that's done women only. And it's like between 1 and 2 million women who do this. It's amazing. And as I discovered, this ritual started as a backyard ritual for menarche rituals. I'm going to say that nearly everything started that way. That's my
Yeah.
that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Sticking to it, Barbara. And the more I spin it out, the more true it appears to be. So anyway, what I'm describing is that I've had a life where, the connectedness, the poetry, the imagery and connection with nature were always there. They were there with me from the time I was born, and probably carried in some ways by my family, which encouraged my poetry and also my love of nature. So those things are there just forever. But then there are these incredible traditions that the Mesopotamian literature has retained, and because the archaeologists went back and found these tablets and transcribed them, this literature that is 4,300 years old just transfixes me, and it's a part of my spirituality now too, as a poet, because I can't not engage with it, of Inanna. And then the goddesses of South India, they're so real to me because I've been to their houses and I've seen them in their temples and felt them and bowed to them and been subdued by them and all kinds of things. And this plays in exactly for what became then my profession in the last 20 years, let's say, of teaching more than just teaching writing, of teaching women's spirituality. So I became a professor, and then I became a co-director of a program that had started at California Institute of Integral Studies and then went over to New College of California. It was taken over there by Rose Francis and the late Ani Mandar. And it passed into my hands, and I immediately turned to Diane and then later to one of my graduates, Judy Grahn, and we all eventually became co-directors, which is the only way to do anything. You can't be artful and direct anything for any length of time. It becomes exhausting. And we had wonderful faculty, Louis Satish and Vicki Noble and Shiloh McLeod were just some. We had multitudes of teachers that we worked with over the years. And we were at New College until that school collapsed, and then we moved the program to Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which was a very appropriate place to put it, and till that school collapsed. So that was like, for me, about a 14-year career of co-directing, something I never thought I'd be able to do, but there I was doing it. So anyway, that's
yeah. What did you teach in that master's program, and how did that program define women's spirituality?
We defined women's spirituality broadly because students would come in from with having a background in patriarchal religions, but seeking the sacred feminine within it. And we would help them do that just as eagerly and just as loyally as we would the people who came wanting to know about the goddess. So it was a broad definition. We had students who were Unitarian, who were Mormon, who were Catholic, who were Protestant, who were atheists, who were Jewish, and they had been Muslim for some period of time, and we just helped them in the 1 or 2 years that we had to work with them. We simply helped them become more authentically empowered as women within whatever tradition it was that was calling to them in this life, without judging. So that that's how that went. And that is a different perspective than the one of just simply seeking the goddess traditions. And I have to say that in uncovering goddess traditions, I have not found her to be all by herself. She's always has the companions. She always has the males, and they might be her sons, but they also are gods, in and of themselves. Inanna was in the context, she's like the third generation in Sumerian poetry. She's like the third generation of pantheons that included male and female constructions of the wind as a deity, constructions of the moon. Those were male-female couples. And the sky was male, and Inanna's grandfather, Enki, who is fresh water and also semen. So she's Venus, and she became extremely powerful because these women poets got hold of her about, as I say, 4,300 years ago. But she's not all by herself, and I find that to be fascinating. I want to know more about that. It's like, to me, it makes the movement bigger. It makes it possible for me to imagine women constructing philosophies that apply to everybody, constructing rituals and so on that apply to everybody. I think that's an important development. I think it is a development, and I think it's inevitably that's what's going to need to happen.
To have unity, to really find our common ground, and
yes, to be looking for common ground, but not from a position of compromise, not from a position of subduing the feminine. It's quite tricky to do that, but I think it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is
anyway?
I'm curious. I'll say that again. I'm sorry, Judy.
Oh, I just was taking a breath because it seems like I just said a whole bunch. Yeah. But go ahead.
I wanted to ask you. I'm intrigued by this, that you taught women. There were Jewish women, Mormon women, Christian women. Mormons are Christian, but I was a Mormon for 11 years, very devout.
Okay, were you? All right.
Yeah. I joined when I was 19, and I left around age 32. And
okay.
Yeah. So I have a sense of the good things that can happen in a patriarchal religion. It's very patriarchal.
Right.
What is some of the common ground of women's spirituality? Were there any threads that related, that a common thread or two that went through these different religions that you were teaching women's spirituality in your program? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I think that it's not probably not different from techniques that almost any other feminist program would use to see through history, to read through it, to look at the imagery of, just as an example, look at an archaeology book and not read what the titles say this is, but cover that up with your hand and just look at the image and tell yourself what it looks like. Mm-hmm. Just for example. And that's a metaphor for reading under the history, so that there would be women, an Irish woman, who wanted to know about Sheila na Gigs and would have to go to Ireland and talk to people who might need you to ask several different questions, several different ways, before you would get any sense of this as a hint of how this or Bridget or any of the other deities would have anything to do with goddesses, you know. So just learning how to unparse stories, how to unravel, how to see that there's a patriarchal veneer over most stories that are about women's power. That's one thing that I love about the rituals. I taught metaformic theory, and one way that I taught it was to ask women to investigate food substances from their own culture or any culture they were interested in and find the menstrual origins of it or anything related to that. And there was a whole method for doing that. So, for example, we had a Mormon student who was rebelling. I'm telling a story on her. I hope she doesn't mind. And Mormons do not drink coffee, as you know. So she was working in the Starbucks as a rebellion.
Yeah.
And she decided to take coffee on and see if it was metaformic, and found that the origin of it is in East Africa and Ethiopia especially, among especially herding peoples. Only the women can gather the berries. The berries are red. They stain your hands red. The berries are part of sacred tradition. They're treated in a very special manner, and they're associated with hymen blood, which is assumed to be menstruation, first menstruation. So, you know, that's
fascinating. That is fascinating.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah,
and
it really is.
So we went traipsing after chocolate and tobacco and just all manner of food substances, some of them from people's own backgrounds that they, you know, were curious about, or other kinds of rituals. So somebody from China did a whole study of the fox and its relationship to menstruation and so on. So it's just really very hands-on way of locating the feminine, and their sacredness is going to be in there, women's bodies are going to be in there, menstruation is going to be in there, and once you're in that room, you are talking about women's contributions to culture. So it all kind of works as a piece. I don't know that all of the students appreciated all of that, but I think they had a pretty good time doing their research. And they came up with some marvelous things. You know, there were people who wanted to know about vampires from Eastern Europe and candle ceremonies, you know, from Scandinavia, and just all kinds of things. So very, very basil from India, which is a sacred plant, tulsi. Tulsi. Yeah. Yes. So you can see that it's fun.
It sounds like
it's
great
challenging.
fun. It was
fun.
Yeah. And each student bringing a different interest along those lines on the metaformic theory.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So the commonality.
Very stimulating for you as teachers,
too.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with this. Yes. I would drag in sacks of red pepper and, you know, just long red cords and all kinds of things, trying to illustrate. And then PowerPoint came along, and I learned PowerPoint, and then I could just fearlessly rip images off of the web, you know, when it was really wide open at that time, and have illustrations, and the web was helping with the research because people were wanting to put up their menarche rituals. Some Apache people did that, some Navajo people did that, you know, because they were proud of their traditions and they wanted to hang on to them. So there was all kinds of clues in there, and things related to corn and so on. So it was just like very, very rich piece of it. I can't tell you. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you have that chronicled in writing anywhere for people to read about?
Nah, not that. Not about.
Well, they got it here. They're getting it here, aren't they?
Students do. But here's what they can do. They can go up and read some of these articles that I wrote and that my colleagues wrote, and some of our students also, on a site called it's Metaformia Journal, METAF as in formidable, ORMIA, Metaformia Journal, .com or whatever, and that'll get them to a site. It's an archive site. It's not a living magazine anymore, but it has a lot of articles on it, including some of mine.
I've been there. Yeah, I've been there.
Yes.
Long time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we'll put that link. I'll publish the link here along with the interview, and people will be able to find that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So,
Judy, besides the fact that the Jewish tradition traces back to goddesses who were, decimated in the Old Testament. That was a whole battle against the prophets and the goddesses that preceded Judaism as we know it today. And Islam, the same thing. Before Allah was Allah, And the old sons that they're called, I can't remember the Muslim word, but it means the old sons. They circumambulate, in Mecca around the black stone, which was a meteorite with a Aphroditic cleft, a vulvic cleft in it. And so they all have, the Abrahamic religions have these goddess origins.
That's right. They have to, because they grew out of those religions. And so, of course, they still have those elements, and the Christian saints and the locations of Christian churches and so on, all very rich. The Black Madonna, there's a whole movement of people who following, especially Lucia Birnbaum, who taught at the California Institute of Integral Studies for a long time and was actually on my committee. She led lots and lots of pilgrimages to go take a look at what are called Black Madonnas in the Catholic tradition. And there's very rich metaphoric pieces to that as well. And we had some students who researched that. So, we should try to get anthologies together just of our students' work, and would be quite amazing.
It would be quite amazing. Okay, that's your next, like you need another project and another book to write, don't you?
I don't need another project, please.
You said it, I didn't. So what is your, but go ahead.
No, I was going to go into this second. I don't know how much time I'm taking up. Do I have more time to?
Of course you do. You have as much time as you want, really. Yeah.
Okay. So, another question is, what do I mean by recovering a broken tradition? Because that was one of the questions, one of the things that I said I was doing. And, of course, the question makes me have to think about what do I mean by that. It basically encompasses everything that I've written has been a recovery of some kind of broken tradition. It's recovering female spiritual centrality is just some of it. Some of it is also the LGBT piece, where the anti-woman and the anti-feminist piece overlaps with this completely. But the medical, psychiatric, military, police, government, family, church, religion, And as I said, even the Marxist resistance movements have had to be challenged and changed in order for us even to have our lives, to live our lives, to be feminist, to be lesbian, to be gay, to be transgender, and bisexual. All of that has had to be challenged and changed. So I consider that everything I've done along those lines, I'm recovering broken traditions, because in the past there were many, many peoples who honored women. Women were leaders, women were warriors, women were, people, homosexual people and cross-dressing people had particular kinds of offices in some tribes. It's not to say that everything was rosy. We're not trying to say that at all. Just that to get a little hope in the face of complete exclusion and pathologizing and being trapped in mental institutions and subjected to lobotomies and all kinds of other horrific so-called treatments that aren't treatments at all. They're just attempts to make a certain kind of patriarchal conformity possible for everyone. Oh, goody! Those liberation movements are ongoing, and they have to be ongoing, because these patriarchal religions are very, very powerful. They remain powerful even now, even today. And the challenging has had massive success. There's been liberation of all kinds of people in all kinds of ways, and growing out of that. So, and this is not to say, and this is where I differ from some feminists and spiritual feminists, the patriarchy has had a lot of value. It has contributed massively to the qualities of our lives in certain kinds of ways. I am not constrained in my life to grind corn in a metate all day long. I am not having to have 10 children because only 2 of them are going to live through whatever, European plague or famine or whatever, flood, whatever else is going on. I have a washing machine. There are all kinds of things. I wear glasses. I'm not blind at this age. I have hearing aids. I'm not deaf. So, there's ways that the mechanistic science, and it was its own revolution, the Reformation and so on, has contributed enormously to who we are and what makes our lives possible. And we take them for granted and simply, in a way, demonize them in ways that are not appropriate. It's just not appropriate. So one of the things about the metaphoric consciousness piece is that it posits that this is all an evolutionary process, and that instead of imagining that the patriarchs stole everything from the feminine and co-opted it to use for themselves, to instead think of them as sons and brothers of the women who created these traditions, and they developed their own traditions. And in some cases, when the things that they have developed are very desirable and desired by the women, by the women who perhaps have used up their land, let's say, or have so their economy is at a standstill, or some illness has come along and their gods don't cure it, and so they're very grateful to have vaccinations, for example, or something that will help with scabies that doesn't take 2 years to cure it, and that sort of thing. So I think it's important to stay balanced with that idea. I'm just going to say that.
This is reminding me of what I heard the Kogi or Koji say, the tribe in South America. I don't remember which country.
In Colombia, I think.
Okay, Kogi, and they had no contact with the modern world until the 90s, when they were getting the message that humans were pretty much destroying Mother Earth.
Right. Right.
And they came forward, and they described, so they made a bridge to the white man or the Western world, and they came forward and they described the four directions that humanity had gone, many thousands of years earlier, and the one that went to the north was the brother. They did it in male terms. They spoke about it in male terms. The brother who was the inventor. And I think everything you're talking about, you've mentioned, has to do, in my view, with the inventor. Inventing machines, inventing medicines, inventing through science, and that sort of. And then just it's a matter we've gotten too far away from the rest of the fabric of life.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm certainly glad to have a washing machine too, Judy, and to be able to talk to you on the phone.
Know. Yes, exactly. Here we are, hundreds of miles apart, and yet able to be together in this, and very connected in this connectivity that's been created. And it's gone way too far. Now it needs to be balanced. It needs to be challenged all along the way, and made to change, even forced to change if necessary, because it has gone way, way, way too far, and is endangering all kinds of things and triggering off to wars and so on, so as we know. So, there's that. I'm glad to have a chance to talk a little bit about that aspect of what is developing into really basically a philosophy in my life. I want to talk a little bit more about recovering from broken traditions, because there's other pieces to this. One is Another Mother Tongue is addressing lesbian and gay mythic history, and that book came out in the 80s. And from a more of a psychological or psychosocial or even psychospiritual perspective, I'm participating with and following the lead of others who are redefining the whole subject of madness. They're breaking the pathologizing of behavioral difference, and they now have a new movement, and it's called neurodiversity. So, and I am a neurodivergent person. For several reasons. My family gave me all kinds of things to work with, including that my mother was schizophrenic, and my father was alcoholic. My brother sexually abused me. My mother was a danger to me for a long time when I was a kid. And I have written sort of around the edges of this. Haven't even been really able to talk about it very much, but I'm starting to be able to. I actually went through one of the things that happened in Eleanor's program is that I met Diane Jeanette, and we bonded over the fact that both of us have schizophrenic mothers. And we went through, and with each other, a remothering process that I hope we get to talk about sometime, because
wonderful.
I think that would be very important to do. But I've done other things, a tape, a poetic tape, March to the Mother Sea, that's about incest surviving, and that came out in 1989. Somebody just wrote me who's using it in an article she's writing about how you go about establishing a classroom in which you can teach about incest. And then a poem, a 9-part poem that I wrote that's in Hanging on Our Own Bones, that's called Mental, which is actually trying to do this, of taking the pathology out of behavioral difference, but I do it by pointing out just how crazy the police are and the government. just how crazy the patriarchy is. For the police, especially right now, they can't see straight. They're so terrified, and they just are blowing people away. So, literally. So anyway, there's that, that's going on. But there's also something else my parents gave me that I'm only now really coming. I won't say that. That's not true. It's not only. There's no only. There's like in a brand new way, I'm coming to appreciate my parents. They had a secret. They had a very deeply held secret. They were nominally Christians, although I never saw them at church. But they sent me to church. They gave me the family Bible. They gave me a huge Bible of my own by the time I was 10, and saw me as a spiritual person. They started seeing me as a spiritual person when I was only 3 years old. And I was the one who conducted my father's memorial, which I did in my dyke clothes and using the poetry that he had loved. Anyway, and my mother stayed through the whole little service, which was gratifying to me because she was extremely, extremely sensitive and shy. But I just want to tell this story that I am understanding that I've inherited a spiritual tradition indigenous to pre-Christian Scandinavia. And just so pleased about that, I knew that I was supposed to have some access that was different from other people. I knew that when I was a kid, but I just couldn't find what it was. And my father would talk out loud whenever we left the room. We lived in this tiny little place. My mother and I would go in the kitchen, and there he would be talking to himself in the living room. But he didn't seem to be talking to himself. He seemed to be talking to somebody else. So, I mean, we had a very paranoid atmosphere, and I thought that he was plotting against us. I thought he was complaining about us or something. Nevertheless, when I grew up, I started talking to the air like that because I get answers when I do that. And I work, the best way that I work is if no one else is around, and I just wander around the house talking out loud and talking to someone, and the answers come. Then when I was about 26, I was recovering from a coma that I had fallen into. I fell into an encephalitis illness followed with a coma, and I came out of it very, very happy. And about maybe 6 months later, I was unhappy. I was in a moment of just despair. And I had a vision of a woman in black sitting on the mesa looking at me. And she told me, just don't worry about anything else. Just do your work. And I took her advice. That's exactly what I did then. And she showed up again about maybe 6-7 years later, right when I was starting to research menstruation and women's cultural power. She shows up in my room as this red-headed person squatting on the floor, telling me, I'm here to help you. And she showed up, a couple other ways. And then in the 80s, I learned how to use a pendulum, and the pendulum told me that she was this spirit, and that this was, coming out of my intuitive center, and began telling me anything I ask, she answers. I could ask her about Pluto, and she would tell me something. Quite astounding. And not only things about my health, and not only things about other people's health, which I try very hard not to ever tell them about, but all kinds of information, including she was really helping me with Blood, Bread, and Roses, because there was some of that research was difficult to get to, and I was revising my outline. Beacon Press had signed up to publish this book in 1981, and I delivered it to them in 1993. They were very patient with me through all that time, because I just kept revising it. And when I used Monique, which is the name of my pendulum and my spirit, she would just tell me things that I could not have known otherwise. So that, I was saying things like, are you trying to tell me, I was really shouting at her, are you trying to tell me that I'm going to find out that precious metals like gold were associated with menstruation? And she was like, yes, you are going to find that out. And I did find that out.
And Judy, when we were talking earlier, way early in the interview, I flipped open my book, Blood, Bread, and Roses, my copy, and it flipped open to minerals. Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And there are those people that you were talking about, the Koji people from Colombia. Gold is menstruation to them, as I learned in doing the research, or that's what the book said anyway. Anyway, now I find out that my father was talking to a spirit, and gradually over the decades, I started. My mother answered a couple of questions. She was always terrified that she was going to be dragged off to the mental hospital if she talked about her inner life, her visions, her hallucinations, her fears, that I'm sure horribly ugly things that had come upon her in Chicago, because schizophrenics and other really highly sensitive people are sensitive to the violence that's all around in America. Schizophrenics in America hear their voices say very different things, very violent things, compared to schizophrenics in India, for example, or in Africa, parts of Africa. Yes, which should tell us a lot about trying to keep beautiful things around sensitive people, especially not warmongering and rude and horribly violent stuff. Anyway, I'm trying to get to the point of my story, is that my father had inherited a spirit. He inherited a spirit from his tradition. He was born in Sweden. And the spirit can appear in the form of a creature, but also as a woman. And it attaches to you and helps you through your life. And Monique has told me that it's okay for me to talk about her on this program. So, and I even have now, because there are neo-pagans online who are talking about this, I know the name of these spirits. They're called Phylgia. And that's what she is.
Would you spell that? Would you spell that for us?
It's Phylgja. So I don't know a lot, of course. It's a broken tradition, and I'm just sort of learning about it, piecing it together. I have a Finnish friend who is a Wen spirituality teacher, and I said, Falgyo, have you ever heard of that? Oh, yes, of course, Falgyo. So it's like, pagans listening in are going to say, well, Judy, of course, Falgyo. But my family didn't talk about this at all. They would have been quite frightened too, I think, because the Inquisition went to Sweden, and because the Christian religion cannot tolerate, and does not, for the most part, tolerate these kinds of things, although it's couched in other terms as angels, and there are different aspects, of course, of all these religions that have a mysticism, as it's called, an engagement with the mystery, meaning the mother, built into it. But anyway, I'm starting to put it together, and it makes me extremely happy to just feel as though I'm not just making something up. These visions all did add up to something that a whole group of people would say, well, yeah, of course. Of course you have that. Why not? You know what I mean? So anyway, I thought you...
Yeah.
Sorry? What?
The normalcy of it, that it's not...
Yes, the normalcy of it. And also that they have, in addition, the Scandinavian spirit tradition and understands an inspiriting of all manner of natural formations, including stones and trees, as well as creatures and so on. So I am actually writing about that right now. I'm writing about it in I call it my creature book. It's creatures and telepathy and consciousness. I'm trying to map different kinds of creature and spirit reach across to me through an examination, close poetry mind examination of my own experiences. So I'm having a great time doing this, and I'm hoping to wrap it up this year and get it published. So that's
wonderful.
One thing.
That is wonderful.
To bring it all up to date. That's one thing I'm working on.
Yeah.
And I'm just continuing with everything else. I have 2 more book-length poems to write. So knock on wood, I'll do it. And some essays on the poets who put Inanna's literature in play, and more metaformic consciousness. I want to tell you about that because there's a group of people who are putting together an institute to study my work, and they've already started this with a residency. It's called the My Good Judy Residency in New Orleans, and I think there have been 5 people who've already taken this residency this year. These are just for artists, poets, scholars, and performers who want to study my work and who do their own work that overlaps with mine, or intersects with it in some kind of way. From anywhere they can go and live in a lovely apartment from 1 to 6 weeks in New Orleans. So I just wanted to say that's happening, and there's also an institute that's going to be teaching aspects of my work that's going to be coming along. I just wanted people to know about that.
And are you going to give me some links that people can
follow?
Yes. Okay.
Yes. And we're working on the website now, so that's not up there. But the My Good Judy Residency, I can give you a link for that. I'll send it to you.
Great.
Right. Yep.
It's just it's thrilling. I mean, it is so inspiring to me, and should be to everyone who listens to this, to hear, to feel, and the trajectory of your work from 1956, when it was very dangerous to come out, coming out, and the whole evolution of your work that you have described, and how you are continuing with this new evolution with the neurodiversity and being neurodivergent. It's just marvelous.
Well. Thank you for giving me this chance to, talk about it. It's a rare
important
thing that happens. Yeah. So I'm still teaching. I still give readings. And I still travel around even a little bit. But things like this podcast are easier to do this than it is to fly out to New York or whatever.
Yeah, and this will last down through the generations. That's the intention, is to really bring the vision that you and the other four mothers are carrying. Each of you is so distinct. It's really beautiful to see that diversity and that uniqueness of each woman and her vision, and to preserve the historical reality, to establish the historicity of your work and how it emerged from period of second wave feminism.
Yes, it emerged in the context of, because of course the community has been it's been what keeps it all rolling along and keeps it in some context, and it's not some eccentric thing that you're doing in a log cabin in the woods somewhere. It's always in the context of these incredible people, and I am so admiring of you that you would take it on to do all of these interviews, but I'm also a little bit jealous because you're going to be the person who knows more about us than anybody else. You'll be amazed.
Yeah, I feel just very richly blessed. I am, I'll write some kind of an essay to go onto the website, the Online Resource Center, to describe some of the common threads and the inspiration and the diversity. I'm very blessed by doing it, so you should be jealous. I'd be jealous if I wasn't doing it. So yeah. It's incredible. And I just encourage everyone to listen to every one of these, or view or listen to every one of these interviews, because it's absolutely stunning, the coverage of knowledge and vision and wisdom and beauty and creativity. It's really marvelous. Yeah. And your life, your work, as you've described it, in such a beautiful trajectory from way back then up to now, is really inspiring. So, Judy, is there anything you want to add here at the end? Any last message or anything uncovered?
No, I think that I've said all that I need to say for this time, and I just want to thank you for this opportunity, and thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure and my blessing. So everyone, thank you for joining us. You will be able to see the links by which you can connect with Judy and her work, get her books, and track what she's doing here now in the next leg of her work, the next era of her work. So, again, Judy, thank you, and thank you, everyone, for listening.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
Bye. Be online. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Be online.